I'm Eric Barnes with the Daily Memphian, and welcome to this edition of the Extra Podcast. Today we're visiting with Thor Kvande, headmaster, head of school at Grace St. Luke's Episcopal School, to talk about the huge challenges that schools face as they teach remotely, as they look at reopening, and as they just face unprecedented challenges. Thor, thanks for joining us.
Eric, thanks for having me. Good to see you.
I'll also make a note that this week, depending on when you're listening to this, we had Joris Ray, Dr. Joris Ray, the superintendent of Shelby County Schools, on Behind the Headlines. That's available as a podcast on the Daily Memphian or wherever you get your podcasts, or you can go to wkno.org. But Thor, I want to talk to you for a bunch of reasons. One is that there are, 50 plus private schools in the Memphis area, maybe 60. It's a big part of the education community. I also want to talk to you because GSL is a school that goes from two-year-old pre-K through 8th grade. It has very big after-school care programs in normal times, has big summer camp programs, it has sports programs. And so you deal with students of many ages and parents of different places, a lot of working parents. The other reason is, and this is also a disclosure, is my kids went to GSL. You and I are friends. I am a former board member. I'm a former board chair. You're sitting in your office, and I spent many hours as board chair or board president in that office. But that is a disclosure as well. And I should also disclose I am a very modest ongoing donor to Grace St. Luke's Episcopal School. So again, appreciate you doing this. Thanks for being here.
Well, thanks for having me, Eric. I appreciate the chance to visit, and happy to share what I can.
Yeah. Let's go. I think I want to walk through how y'all handled the spring, how you're handling the summer, and what you're looking ahead towards in the fall. I mean, we can bounce around and all that, but that's kind of my general plan. And again, my kids are in college now, so I hear through friends who have kids in school, but every school handled things differently. I don't know, anyone did it perfectly. So I would assume in mid to late March, you suddenly found yourself having to close the school down and send everybody home and implement a crash course in online learning?
Right. So actually, I'll go back even a little bit further. I was up in Philadelphia in late February for the National Conference of Independent Schools. Was held in February up in Philadelphia this year. And so I was up there. And while I was at the conference, we began to hear the rumblings that, hey, there's a new virus emerging, and it's beginning to look like something serious. And you might need to begin thinking about it. And as I was at the conference, I was talking with different heads who had exchange students or foreign students, some of them Chinese nationals, in their school communities. And they began to share with all of the other heads about what they were hearing and learning. And so we began thinking about what this might be and how it might play out in our community. And NAIS actually offered some workshops on it on the spot to help us all begin thinking about it. And so when I came back to Memphis, we had about a week or so before spring break. And at that point, we began to put some preparations in place. We asked people to take all their books and materials home over the spring break.
And I'll interrupt you, just say, knowing that you'd shut down, or just in case? It was a just in case.
Just in case. We weren't quite sure what it was going to look like. Because it was still, thinking back to that time is like going back 10 years, it feels like.
Yeah.
It's just really been such a whirlwind, and there's new information coming out all the time. But we asked everyone to take their materials home, thinking it was more out of an abundance of caution than almost anything else. And as we got into the spring break, it became clear that we needed to plan for some type of remote learning. And so sat down with my leadership team and began to write out the plan for what remote learning was going to look like in the fall, or in the spring, rather.
So I mean, as a parent, and most people, even if you're not a parent, I think if you can remember back to middle school. So let's say 6, 7, 8, 5, 6, 7, 8, those grades, which GSL has, you can picture that sending the books home, online learning, and we can talk about that in a second. What in the world did you do with sort of the kindergartners through second, third graders, the quasi-toddlers, the kids who bounce around? GSL is a very active school. It's not a sort of sit in your place. And I mean, there's a lot going on, a lot of movement. I mean, it's just a place in motion. It's not sit there. I mean, there's some sitting still, but not all day long. What in the world did you do for that sort of group of kids who aren't going to pay attention to a screen in this way, I would imagine?
Sure. Yeah, you're absolutely right, Eric. The point is that every grade level, every age group presents a different set of challenges in terms of their attention span, their willingness to engage, and what's going to be successful with them. I think, particularly as you get into K1 and 2, we learned a lot over the course of the spring in terms of things that worked and things that didn't work. I think we learned a lot about here's the type of material that we want to present asynchronously. Here's the type of material or activities we want to do synchronously. So asynchronously meaning, this might be a video that you can watch at your leisure, 5 or 10 minutes, versus here's something synchronous where we're sitting face to face or video to video, as it were, and working together in either individuals, one student, one teacher, or small group settings to build on the knowledge and the work that the kids need to have. It's a challenge. As a teacher, you have to learn new tricks and new techniques to engage students online because your normal class management techniques might not work in an online setting. You just have to adapt.
For those young kids, about how many hours a day or minutes a day could you keep them engaged in some sort of Zoom-like thing? I mean, what you may have started at one point and then realized the sweet spot was more like what?
Yeah, and we actually ratcheted it up based on some parent feedback that we got. They were looking for more engagement. So we started out at one level and then began to increase it. And when we increased it, one of the things that we tried to do was go to more individual or small group work. So it was less sort of everybody in second grade is sitting down, getting a lesson together, and more, you've gotten a lesson or an outline of things at the beginning of the week, at the beginning of the day, and then you're meeting with your teacher and in small groups, working on those things, trying to look at, hey, Eric, what do you specifically need to know about this language arts piece that we're working on, or the math concept that we're working on? So you really began to see that we were trying to zero in on each individual child and allocate time for each individual child. But overall, the number of meetings per week that we had with students began to go up, and the length began to increase over time. Because I think parents were looking for more engagement. And I think if we had been able to keep them in front of the screen for all 7 hours, that would have been ideal.
Well, yeah.
But that's also really part of the challenge is it's, that's probably not what's best for anybody. You've got to have a mix of time when you're directly engaged and time when you're working independently.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and I have so many questions. I mean, as I mentioned at the top, I mean, GSL is a school with a lot of working parents, but where both parents work. I mean, that's just historically in my, 20 years of association with the school. It's more than that. To some degree, did the parent feedback come about as engage them more because parents needed to work? I mean, I have many friends, again, my kids they've been home, and I have college kids, and it's a little more sort of, could you clean up the vodka from last night? I mean, it's not really, it is as low maintenance as it gets, and it's still, the house gets real small real quickly. Was part of that parent feedback, honestly, people saying like, look, I've got a job, and I need help with childcare, let alone education and engagement and learning and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think our parents, as you mentioned, the vast majority of them are dual working families. And, some of them are in a position where they're able to adjust to this relatively easily, but many face different kinds of challenges. And, some of the feedback that we saw was, I would like more engagement because that allows me time to do my own job. And it's a real challenge to try and, help make sure Johnny or Susie is properly engaged, as well as do the work for my employer that they're still expecting to come in.
Educationally, I would be presumptuous and say that it was maybe easier with the 6th, 7th, 8th graders, or is that an incorrect assumption?
Yeah, I don't know that I would say easier is the right word, but I think sixth, seventh, and eighth graders are, generally speaking, maybe a little bit more independent. And so they're maybe a little bit more able to adapt to the online environment. And we actually had some feedback from some families who said, my kid actually likes the online better.
Yeah.
They like the independence. And so for a certain subset of students, there really were some uh, folks who wound up saying, we prefer the online because I can engage at my own pace. I can kind of manage myself a lot more independently and so on. And developmentally, that's sort of what you're wanting for your child is you want them to become more independent. You want them to take more ownership of their learning and just everything that they're doing in their lives. But it really was a really interesting subset of kids that we began to hear some family feedback around my kid prefers it.
Well, and that's a generation that has grown up with FaceTime and Snapchat and now TikTok and all these sort of social media, video, phone based. I mean, it's a much more comfortable environment than maybe, other people who are older who didn't grow up with that. I'm sure I've been on Zooms with people who stereotypically tend to be a bit older and, the camera sideways. And there's just a lot of there's just a real discomfort with it. That's not a judgment. It's just that them grow up and it's not part of their social life that they're on video and communicating electronically. But that fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, certainly seventh, eighth, most of them, that's part of their bread and butter of their existence.
But I'll tell you what's interesting, Eric, you're right in all of that. But the one thing that you didn't mention in the list of different technological applications that—
oh God, I'm sure I missed some.
It's email.
Email.
Right?
Oh.
We are actually not really good at email.
This is true. And this is very funny.
It's so fascinating. And so this was a real learning point for us as an organization because we made a decision as we sat down to orchestrate our learning plan and all the rest of it, that we were going to use Google and Google Meets, the whole Google suite of educational tools, because we've been a Google school for quite some time, and we really decided to jump in with both feet and leverage everything that Google offered to help make the online work. It's dependent on emails. It generates a ton of emails, and we had to coach students how to check email, how to respond to email, how to accept meeting invites, get it on your calendar, and where you're supposed to be, when you're supposed to be. It was utterly fascinating.
This, by the way, is a very common problem with millennials in the workplace. And I will see that. I mean, they are great, wonderful, smart, so on, but they get to the workplace and they don't check their emails. I've seen it happen. I know lots of people in the work who are dealing with like this great person. They didn't check their email for 3 days. Like, you can't not check your email for 3 days. Because everyone thought email would die and kids don't use it, and that's not how they communicate. So it's very funny. Let me do a quick sponsor message. I'm gonna come back and ask you a few more things here real quick. But a reminder that this podcast is brought to you by FedEx. Possibilities, what we deliver by delivering. The Extra Podcast is one of many weekly podcasts we do at the Daily Memphian, including the Behind the Headlines podcast, as well as shows on politics, food, sports we're getting back to, with the Grizzlies looking like they are probably kind of sort of going to start back up. So Chris Harrington and Drew Hill are doing a sports Grizzlies podcast, and maybe at some point we'll get back to Tigers and so on. All our podcasts are on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, the Daily Memphian website, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm gonna skip. We talked so much about technology there. I mean, GSL is a private school. I mean, so by definition, people are paying tuition to go there. A very large portion, as is the case with many private schools. There's more financial aid than I think people realize. But I would assume most everyone in the school had access to computer and some level of broadband internet. The challenges that many other schools you admittedly don't have in terms of being able to, can you imagine how difficult this would be if 50-75% of your students or your families didn't have broadband? I mean, it's breathtakingly, it's heartbreaking, really, to think about.
It's unbelievable to think about. And we did do some certain things to make sure that everyone in our community had internet access, just out of our own due diligence. We wanted to make sure everybody had access, but to think about the scale that you're describing, in terms of trying to orchestrate internet access, I mean, it's massive. It would be overwhelming to face that kind of challenge. And all the respect in the world for folks who are trying to tackle that in addition to everything else.
I jumped over somewhat purposefully. So for the 2-year-old, 3, 4-year-olds, did you just send them home and say, goodbye, good luck? Or did you actually try to do programs for the little kids as well?
We actually tried, because we felt it was important to keep that connection and keep that community and try to deliver on our mission. And, it's funny, I went to a number of different webinars and seminars throughout all of this. All the heads were doing this to try and learn as much as they could about different things. And, there's no online seminar out there about how to do early childhood education online. And there's good reason for that. It's best done in person. And, so we really worked hard to try and replicate the kind of connection that teachers have with students and try to give them some early literacy, give them some early mathematical work so that they're ready for the next grade level. But it's definitely a challenge. And it's something that, we continue to work on and refine as we prepare for the fall.
Yeah, and we'll get to the fall in just a second, but I wanted to touch on two things that normally in normal times, GSL, like a lot of schools, not a lot, but some schools around Memphis, has a big summer camp program. My kids, a working parent too, with the kid's mom and I both worked, and so they were full featured up till a certain age. They packed it in at summer camps, and the summer camps were fun. There was a little bit of learning, but on a very pragmatic level, it was childcare. And that is the thing. I was listening to a podcast this morning about national issues about childcare, that a person making the case that there is no reopening until there is childcare, whether that is school or that is daycare or that is after school care. And childcare is expensive. I mean, I think the stat was something like, for many middle-class families, they're spending, single moms particularly might spend 50% of their income on quality childcare. I mean, it's just a huge challenge that I think we all know, but there hasn't been a specific stimulus package for childcare, right? But we're facing that as we look towards the fall. For the summer, before we get to the fall, you told me before we started that you are actually going to cancel most of the summer camps, but you're going to do some. What's that look like, given the pandemic and the risks and no one wants to get sick?
Sure. This is something that we spent a lot of time thinking about and studying. We actually had a separate task force devoted to this, looking at all the different issues around summer camp and what's feasible, what's not feasible, what are the various guidances suggesting to us, whether that's CDC or the Shelby County Health Department. And so our main summer camp, which we normally have, we elected not to have based on the different guidances and the like that were available at the time. But we continued to explore different options. We tried some online things, but we also explored the idea of having a smaller scale camp focused first on essential workers and then, expanding out there. And so worked with the Shelby County Health Department to put a plan in place. And so we're able to do that successfully and hoping to launch that, I believe it's next week. So just a 2-week session on campus, and that'll give us a sense of, how the different things work, whether that's the drop off and the pickup, but it also allows us to provide a service to families who really need it. And that's huge. We want to be able to do that kind of thing for families who are crying for some kind of childcare.
So walk me through the safety precautions for the kids and then for the staff.
Yeah, so it's all the things you're reading about in the different newspapers and the like. So it is social distancing as you come into the campus. It's temperature checks and screenings, limited access to the buildings. It's reduced sizes in the classrooms, trying to space people out. It is facial coverings, hand washing.
And this is students and staff. This is
students and staff, although below a certain age, we try not to do that just because of what the recommendations say. So for us, that's the little Luker age group, would typically That'd be
4 years old, that kind of age.
2, 3-year-old.
Yeah.
And then as you get into pre-K, JK, and SK, we're looking at facial coverings for those students as well. But basically, everybody's on campus wearing facial coverings. There's prescribed times when you can take them off to eat and drink and so on. But again, a lot of hand washing. You've got to limit the sharing of materials or basically eliminate it. And then, trying to spend as much time outside as is possible. And we're fortunate that Cynthia Burnett, who's our head of preschool, has done a great job establishing an outdoor classroom in the backyard behind Miss Lee's. And so that's been a resource that we've been developing over the last couple of years. And so that's going to be something that we really look towards both in our summer camp and in our return to campus in the fall.
When my kids played there when they were 2 or 3, it was just a big dirt pit. It wasn't an outdoor classroom. It was just
a little nicer these days.
Yeah, but they loved it. It was awesome. It was awesome. There were no complaints. I guess that segues into what are you reopening in the fall, and what does that look like? Have you finalized your plans?
Those plans are in progress. We've got an extensive team structure in place to help with that, and pretty much every faculty member is involved in one aspect or another of it. And we've got different teams looking at aspects from teaching and learning to health and safety to enrollment to employees and just about anything you can think of. And each of those teams is working on a particular area and bringing it back to the whole so that everything gets coordinated. And we're looking at, just everything you can imagine, from drop off and pick up to how kids move through the hallways, what lunch looks like, so on and so forth. But our hope and intention is to be on campus in the fall and start the school year off in that way.
Testing,
masks. It's going to look very, very different. Yeah.
Will it be temp checks? I mean, masks, everything you basically described for the summer camp. I mean, those same sorts of rules.
You're looking at all those same kind of things. So, looking at a drop-off procedure that includes, completing a screening form. We're looking at some options that we might be able to do it electronically. We're hoping to get away from paper. We might have to start the year with paper, but then be able to go to an electronic option. Temperature screening, as you come through the drop-off line, limiting parent access to the buildings, or basically eliminating it, just so that we're controlling who's in the space and limiting it. Reducing the frequency of travel around campus. We've revised our middle school schedule to be more of a block schedule, so kids have longer times with various instructions. So there's all kinds of changes that we're making to try and facilitate.
This is basically, I mean, you're involved, you mentioned the National Association of Independent Schools. There's a Memphis Association of Independent Schools. This is generally the kinds of things that your peers are looking at doing. I mean, it may vary a bit city to city and city rules and stuff, but this is the kind of approach people are trying to implement, I assume.
Right, and it varies state to state. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention our accrediting body, Southern Association of Independent Schools. They've also been a tremendous resource for heads, hosting all kinds of seminars and forums, and just been an invaluable resource for us. And the Tennessee Association of Independent Schools has been a huge resource as well. So.
Oh, that was you. This is what happens in the age of broadcasting, in the age of
all the electronics are connected.
Yeah, exactly. So there's so many unknowns about coronavirus still, but there are these things that we kind of can generally see to be true. You mentioned the outdoor spaces, that's better than the indoor spaces and all this kind of thing. One is that kids are less apt, not impossible to get at all, but much less apt to get it, much less apt to transmit it. But as you get older, you're more apt to get it, and the ramifications can be worse. And so with staff, I mean, do you have staff that you really are at too high a risk to be there? I mean, and obviously we're not naming names, but I mean, every school's got to face this. Frankly, every business to some degree is facing this, that there are higher risk individuals within any body of adults, any company, any organization. What do you do for those who are at higher risk?
Sure. I think that's where we work really hard on those safety procedures that we've been discussing. And also even just going into every single classroom and trying to look at the physical layout of each classroom and ensure that the faculty member has the appropriate personal space, if you will, from the students. And that's, as you've alluded to, it's very different from how we have typically done things at Grace St. Luke's, because we're a very interactive community, very active community where teachers and kids are, in close contact with each other and working closely together. But now we're in a situation where we have to orchestrate things much more tightly and ensure that there's the appropriate amount of distance between students and teacher and between the students themselves.
Well, you after school care programs, again, that's a big part of what many schools do. That with all the rules and precautions in place, but that's a big part of it.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, the pressure, not that a headmaster ever gets pressure from parents or board members or board presidents ever get emails late at night or phone calls from parents wanting certain things to happen and not happen. What's the sense of the community? Did the parents pressuring you to get back open? And are there parents saying, hey, this is the craziest thing I've ever heard and we shouldn't be opening? I mean, is it a mixed bag or what?
Sure. We did a poll of our parents. This was maybe a couple of weeks ago now. And a strong majority said we'd be ready to send our kids back to school under current circumstances. I think it's probably worth polling them again, because as we've talked, things are changing daily, weekly, hourly.
Dark humor here. It's not funny.
There's probably some new thing I need to read that's just come out in the time that we've been chatting here. So families may change their opinions as we get closer to the start of school. But the overwhelming sense that we got from surveys and from comments on surveys and the like was, we want our children to be back on campus. We want the details of the plan. We want to have it be as safe as possible, but it's really important for our kids to be back on campus. And
last question
goes to like the American Academy of Pediatrics. Their report, which just came out, talks a lot about this, about the, sort of the benefit to kids to being on campus and the social emotional connections that are there and how important they are.
Yeah.
And how do you balance out that against COVID-19 and the risks associated with COVID-19?
Yeah, you went right where I was going, that throughout this, I mean, for everyone, but for kids especially, I mean, and the younger kids maybe more so. I have a friend whose daughter is younger and just understandably couldn't get across to her why she couldn't go see her friends, why she couldn't go to school. She just couldn't, I mean, it's just too much for her to process. I've had a number of friends with younger kids who their kids can't process that. And they're lonely and they're bored and they want to socialize. And so if I'm not mistaken, and this other podcast I was listening to this morning about these issues, just coincidentally, referenced that pediatric study that to some degree, some pediatricians are saying, look, the risks of isolating kids are greater than the risk of COVID, which is a kind of profound, conclusion. And we've all felt that, right? I mean, a certain level of isolation and boredom and, kind of loneliness. I mean, it's just a very difficult thing to do, but for kids who are usually so social. So do you feel that weight, that there is that pressure to just get kids back into a social, semi-normal situation?
Sure. It's huge. I mean, I'm just thinking, as we're talking, Eric, I'm thinking back to, just being on a couple of Zoom calls in the spring with our 8th graders and just the, how hard it was for them in particular to not have sort of all the wonderful 8th grade traditions that we have at Grace St. Luke's in the same way. And a lot of that had to do with the different connections that they had with their friends and teachers and the like. And when you got on the call with them and talked to them, you could just see how much they missed it. You were talking about some of the younger kids, and I think that's absolutely true. But I'd argue that it goes all the way through 8th grade.
Sure.
That those social connections and that ability to connect with your classmates and friends and your teachers is just so tremendously huge. I mean, I can't tell you how many times we heard from kids, I miss school. I want to go back to school. And,
Yeah.
what a profound statement, that our students are saying, we want to be at Grace St. Luke's in school with our teachers and our friends, and we want to be part of that community. And, I think we all think about it, and it's all something that we want to create for our students, but it's important to do it in a very safe and thoughtful way.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we are out of time and we will leave it there. I want another reminder that this podcast is available on our site, on iTunes, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. We also had Joris Ray, superintendent of Shelby County Schools, on Behind the Headlines this week. You can get the video at wkno.org. You can watch it Friday night, or you can download the podcast from our site, wherever you get the podcast. Thor, thanks so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. Stay safe.
Thank you, Eric. I appreciate the invite.
Absolutely. And thank you for joining us. Join us again next week.